Cedar Trail, at the end of June, held its own kind of beauty. Long bands of sunlight across dry ground, winds carrying the scent of burnt grass, and bare dirt roads leading toward small ranches scattered across the prairie. But today, none of that calm reached Cassia Brooks, the young black woman living alone on the land her father left behind. Every step felt heavy, as if she carried the whole weight of her worries. Since her father's death, Cedar Trail Ranch was no longer just a home. It had become something people meant to take. Carlton Fallon, the richest man in the area and someone who never accepted no, had sent his third threat that month. Sell the land before it's too late. But Cassia refused. This land was her father's last memory, and memories were not for sale. She pushed open the door of Lonnie's general store. The bell chimed softly, echoing through the too quiet space. She grabbed what she needed: flour, salt, cooking oil, hoping to finish quickly and return home before dark. But the thing she feared most was already waiting. As she turned, 3 men blocked the aisle: Ruck Fallon, Carlton's cousin, and 2 men Cassia knew well as hired bullies. Their smiles were not the kind meant for a woman. They were the kind worn by men who believed they owned the room. "Where you heading in such a hurry, Miss Brooks?" Ruck asked, his low voice crawling with spite. "Heard you still won't sell to Mr. Carlton." "Shame." Cassia kept her voice steady. "I'm just here to buy supplies. I don't want trouble." "Trouble found you," Ruck said, stepping closer. Cheap whiskey clung to his breath, turning her stomach. The other 2 slid to the sides, blocking every exit. No one else was around. Lonnie was somewhere in the back room, probably out of earshot. Cassia backed up until her spine touched the wooden shelf. A jar of salt trembled beside her hand, as if shaking with her. Ruck placed his hand near her face, forcing her to look at him. "Be honest. A black girl alone, no money, no man, nothing. How long you think you can keep that land?" Cassia pushed his wrist away, her voice tight but firm. "Don't touch me." He only seemed more amused. His hand reached for her shoulder. Then the door opened. The bell chimed again. Silence fell. All of them turned. A man stepped inside. Tall, broad-shouldered, his coat dusted as if he had ridden through miles of open land. His hat shadowed half his face, but the hard line of his jaw and the stillness in his posture shifted the air in the room. He looked at the flower in Cassia's hand, then at the 3 men, calm, deliberate, steady enough to warn without raising his voice. He spoke slowly, each word shaped like a fact no one had the right to dispute. "She's with me." The room froze. Cassia felt her heartbeat thundering in her chest. Ruck narrowed his eyes. "Who the hell are you to step into this?" The man didn't answer him. He took 1 step forward, closing the space between himself and Cassia. He tilted his head toward her, and under the brim of his hat, a pair of gray eyes met hers, quiet, unsettling, and sure. It wasn't pity. It was a decision. "She's with me," he repeated. Ruck laughed, trying to sound fearless. "You think you can save her?" The stranger brushed Ruck's hand off Cassia's shoulder. The motion was slow, gentle, but so final that Ruck stepped back instinctively. Then the man set his hand at Cassia's elbow and drew her toward him. His touch was warm, steady, never forceful. It felt like a shield she had not known she missed. "Stay beside me," he murmured, low enough for only her to hear. Cassia moved toward him. She didn't know why she trusted him, only that standing next to him let her breathe again. For the first time in weeks, she didn't feel alone. Ruck hissed, "This isn't over, Miss Brooks. Carlton won't forget this." The 3 men stormed out, their boots echoing like a threat. When the door shut, only the two of them remained. The man released her arm slowly, as if aware she might tense again. He dipped his head slightly. "Are you all right?" Cassia inhaled. Thank you." He nodded once. "My name is Lander Hayes." Cassia gripped her bag to hide the tremor in her hands. "Lander, you didn't have to step in." He met her eyes, his expression steadier and warmer than she expected. "You looked like you needed help. If you want, I can walk you home. Or, if you'll allow it, I can help you protect your ranch." Cassia's heart pounded. No one had ever said that to her. No one had ever stood with her. Until this moment. She whispered, barely a breath, "I would appreciate it if you came with me." And so Lander walked beside her, as if protecting her was the most natural thing he had ever done. Cedar Trail sat at the far end of a long dirt road, where tall pines cast long shadows each afternoon. Cassia had never allowed anyone to ride behind her all the way home, but today, the steady hoofbeats of Lander Hayes trailing her brought a sense of calm she was not ready to admit. By the time they reached the gate, the sun had slipped behind the hills. Cassia dismounted first, tightening her grip on the reins to hide her unease. She turned to thank Lander again, but he was already on the ground, moving ahead of her with a slow, sure stride, as if he had always belonged to land like this. "Show me the north fence," he said, scanning each stretch of open ground. "I want to be sure no one's been lingering near your ranch." Cassia hesitated. "You don't have to. I don't want to trouble you." "It's no trouble," he replied, his voice low and certain. "You stood alone against 3 men. I'm only checking if more trouble is coming." The simple words struck something deep in her. Since her father's passing, no one had spoken to her with that kind of steady concern. The north fence ran along a slight rise toward the hill. Cassia led the way, and Lander followed close behind, his eyes catching every mark in the dirt, like a man used to tracking. He knelt beside a broken rail, brushing a finger over the split wood. "Someone hit this," he said. Cassia frowned. "An animal? Or—" "No," he cut in gently. "This was snapped. By a grown man. With force." Cassia gripped the nearest rail as if anchoring herself. "They're already watching me?" Lander looked up. As he rose, his hand braced against the ground, and by instinct his fingers brushed her wrist. Firm enough to steady, soft enough to jolt her breath. Heat sparked under her skin. Cassia stepped back half a pace, her cheeks warming even as the evening air cooled. Lander withdrew his hand at once, a faint hint of uncertainty crossing his face, the first time she had seen anything gentle in his expression. "Sorry," he murmured. "I didn't mean to." "It's all right," she said, though her voice was quieter than usual. They continued up the slope. In the thin light, their shadows stretched long across the dry grass. After a moment, Cassia broke the silence. "Where are you from, Lander? I've never seen you around here." He stared ahead, shoulders tightening slightly. "I've passed through many places. I don't stay anywhere long." A reply that opened and closed itself at the same time, shutting her out with careful precision. Cassia asked softly, "Are you running from something?" Lander stopped and turned his head just enough to see her. In the last gold light of day, his eyes looked older, heavier. "Not running. The past just holds things best left alone." Cassia understood the shape of that truth. Wounds had their own language, and not everyone was ready to speak it. She gave a small, quiet smile. "I have things I don't bring up either." But I always hoped my father could see I'm stronger than he thought. Lander looked at her longer than before, his gaze softening. He'd be proud of you. Before she could answer, hoofbeats echoed from the front gate. A rider threw down a tied letter and rode off. Cassia picked it up. One glance at the handwriting told her who it was. Carlton Fallon. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Only a few lines. You won't keep that land long. Think carefully before things turn dangerous. Lander stepped beside her, reading over her shoulder. His eyes darkened, and he clenched the letter so hard the paper bent, the crackle sharp between his fingers. Cassia stared at him, startled. This wasn't mere anger for her sake. This felt like something old, something personal. You hate him? She asked. Lander didn't answer at once. He looked toward the horizon, shoulders drawn taut as a rope pulled too tight. Carlton Fallon has hurt a lot of people, he said at last. You're not the first he tried to take everything from. Cassia stood still. The wind lifted her hair, but the presence beside her grounded her more than she expected. A thought flickered, bold but necessary. Lander, she began, her voice small but steady. If you don't have anywhere to go, you can stay here. Work for a while. The ranch needs help, and she met his eyes, letting honesty rise for the first time. I feel safer when you're here. The evening breeze carried the scent of dry grass, and between them, something quiet and steady formed as Lander looked at her, long, deep, and aware of the shift happening. If that's what you want, he said slowly, I'll stay. And from that moment on, Cedar Trail Ranch no longer belonged to Cassia alone. The first days with Lander at Cedar Trail passed in a calm Cassia did not expect, steady, quiet, and shaped by the presence of a man who worked hard, watched carefully, and kept a respectful distance. On the first morning, Cassia walked to the barn and found Lander already awake. He was fixing the sagging door, sleeves rolled up, muscle lining the length of his arm as he drove each nail. Early sunlight crossed his shoulder, casting a long shadow across the ground. You rise early, Cassia said. Lander didn't look back right away. A ranch runs with the sun. I'm used to it. His voice was low and even, enough to leave a small tremor in her chest. She set the bucket down, ready to help him check the back beams. Hand me the rope over there? He asked. She turned to fetch it, not realizing he had stepped behind her. When she faced him again, he leaned in to reach the rope, his hand brushing across her waist for the briefest moment. Just a glance of contact, but enough to stop her breath. She straightened too fast, hair slipping over her shoulder. Lander stepped back, eyes holding hers for only a second before he bent down to tie the rope as if nothing had happened. Sorry, he said quietly. Didn't mean to make you uncomfortable. It's all right, Cassia answered, softer than she intended. All morning, the warmth at her waist stayed with her like a small flame that refused to go out. By noon, they were hauling water from the well. Cassia bent to grab a bucket rolling in the dust, just as Lander bent at the same time. Their foreheads touched lightly. Cassia drew back in surprise, but Lander remained close, his breath skimming her cheek. He withdrew slowly, letting out a faint sigh. We seem to be running into each other a lot, he muttered, voice deep with a rare hint of unease. Cassia laughed quietly. Seems so. It lasted only an instant, but it deepened something between them all the same. That evening, Cassia prepared a simple meal in the small kitchen. She wasn't used to a man inside her home, but the sound of Lander's steps, the water running as he washed up, the scent of worn leather from his coat. Somehow it made the house feel larger, warmer, lived in. They ate across from each other, lamplight soft along Cassia's cheek. "You cook better than I expected," Lander said. Cassia smiled. "Living alone, I had to learn." "You're better than most," he replied, meeting her eyes a moment too long. The look lingered. Not bold, but enough to make her turn away to hide the smile rising on her lips. After dinner, Lander insisted on washing the dishes. His broad back, his careful hands, his quiet focus. Cassia found herself watching longer than she meant to. Something was shifting. His presence made the house safer, warmer, and made her heart stumble in ways she wasn't used to. That night, when the wind changed, Cassia heard a sound outside, a sharp snap of a capascule branch. Heavy steps in the dirt. She threw on a shawl and opened the door a crack. Lander wasn't in the living room. The front door sat ajar. Fear tightened her chest. She stepped out, then stopped. Lander stood on the porch, alone in the dark, moonlight striking the bridge of his nose and the hard line of his jaw. He wasn't armed. He simply stood there, shoulders squared, listening to the field as if he could read the night itself. When he turned, his eyes were dark but warm, quiet but sure. "You didn't need to come out," he said. "I heard something. I just wanted to be sure no one was near your house." Cassia stood still, watching him. There was something unshakable about the way he held himself in the cold. No boasting, no noise. Just a man who slipped into danger the way others stepped into a room. "Thank you," she whispered. "Truly, thank you." Lander nodded once. "I told you. When I'm here, you don't have to be afraid." And under the thin sweep of moonlight across the wooden porch, Cassia understood something she hadn't allowed herself to consider. Maybe Lander's arrival wasn't chance. Maybe he was the only kind of man steady enough, quiet enough, strong enough to stand beside a heart like hers. Nights at Cedar Trail were usually so quiet that Cassia could hear the grass stirring in the wind. But that night, it wasn't the wind that woke her. It was a strange glow spilling across her bedroom floor, a fierce orange light paired with the crackle of burning wood. She bolted upright. Smoke. She rushed to the window. The barn behind the ranch was engulfed, flames rising like a wild animal ready to swallow what little she had left. For a moment, she didn't feel her feet at all. She ran outside barefoot, panic tearing through her chest. "Storm! Daisy! No!" she cried, voice breaking. But as she reached the barn, a strong arm yanked her back. "Cassia!" Lander shouted, pulling her against his chest. "Stay back! The roof's collapsing!" Cassia struggled hard. "Let me go! My horses!" Lander held tighter, his breath hot against her hair. "I'm going in. You stay here." He pushed her toward safety and without another word, ran straight into the fire. Cassia stood frozen as his figure disappeared into the smoke. Her chest ached with every breath. The helplessness made her knees weak. "Miss Cassia!" a trembling voice called out. Johnson, the older hand who lived nearby, came running, grabbing a bucket from the well. Smoke stung his eyes and he stumbled. Cassia caught him. "Are you all right?" Yes. Let me help." They threw water on the roof, keeping their distance from the heat. But the barn groaned, wood bending inward as if ready to fall. "Lander!" Cassia screamed. At that moment, a dark shape burst through the doorway. Lander was dragging both horses, pulling and pushing at once. He coughed hard, face and clothes coated in ash, but he held the reins tight. Cassia ran to him, grabbing the lead rope. Together they pulled, once, twice. and the terrified horses finally stumbled free of the flames. Just as Storm and Daisy reached safety, Lander's knees buckled. He doubled over, coughing violently. Cassia rushed forward, both hands on his face and neck, her voice trembling with fear and relief. "Lander, are you hurt? Are you—" He caught her hand, squeezing gently. "I'm fine." But his breath was ragged, his face flushed from the heat, the collar of his shirt soaked with sweat. Cassia cupped his cheek, brushing a streak of ash from his jaw. In that moment, Lander caught her wrist. His hand was burning with heat, yet the way he held her was tender, as if she were something fragile. "I won't let them touch you," he said, voice rough from smoke but steady as bedrock. Cassia's chest tightened. No one had ever said that to her. No one had ever run into fire for her. A tremor ran through her, and she had to close her eyes. When she opened them, Lander was still looking at her, a look she had never received from any man before. Worry, gentleness, and something restrained but growing. Johnson cleared his throat, pulling them back to the world around them. "Miss Cassia, this fire wasn't an accident." Lander straightened, his expression sharpening at once. He walked to the wrecked doorway, brushing aside charred wood. "Someone used oil. This was deliberate." He crouched, spotting something in the wet dirt. A deep boot print, clear, hurried. Lander pressed 2 fingers to the mark, his face darkening like a storm building. "These boots, I know them." Cassia stepped closer. "You know who did it?" Lander stared toward the darkness beyond the hill. "Fallon's men." A cold wave ran through Cassia, fear twisted with anger. But when she looked at Lander, his eyes held more than anger. They carried a vow he hadn't spoken out loud, and Cassia knew this night had changed everything. 2 days after the barn was burned, Cedar Trail felt strangely quiet. But it wasn't the quiet of peace. It was the stillness before a larger storm. Cassia tried to keep her routine, feeding the horses, tending the small garden, but her hands trembled each time the memory of the fire returned. Lander stayed close, always appearing where she needed him most. He didn't say much, but his presence made breathing easier. That afternoon, as Cassia scrubbed the charred boards near the barn, unfamiliar hoofbeats echoed from the front gate. She looked up, just as Lander stepped out from behind the grain shed, his alertness sharp as a pulled bowstring. 3 riders entered the yard, and at the center was Carlton Fallon. Black velvet coat, polite smile, eyes cold as polished steel. He dismounted, brushing dust from his shoulder, as if stepping onto property he already owned. "Miss Brooks," Fallon said, voice smooth. "I came to talk cordially." The word cordially scraped across the smoke-stained yard like a sneer. Cassia straightened. "You have no right to be on my land." Fallon smirked. "Stubborn, just like your father. This ranch will be mine sooner or later." But before he could take another step, a shadow blocked his path. Lander, taller by half a head, his shoulders set like a wall. He stood at the doorway, hand resting near his hip, not touching his gun, but close enough to say he could draw it in a heartbeat. "You're not getting near her." His voice was thunder held tight. Fallon stopped, eyes flickering with surprise. "Hayes?" he said. "Didn't expect to see you here." The air tightened. Lander didn't blink. "I work here now, and I'll protect this ranch." Fallon studied him, recognizing something, hiding it behind a thin smile. "You always did have a way of inviting trouble. And you always had a way of making it for others," Lander answered. Fallon's hands clenched, though his tone stayed polite. I came to give Miss Brooks one final offer. He turned toward Cassia, his smile sharpening. If you don't sell this land within the week, you'll regret it. This time it was the barn. Next time, it may be the house. Cassia felt something tighten around her throat. He spoke softly, but he struck the deepest fear she carried. Lander stepped forward, voice dropping to a dangerous calm. If you come here again, the one who regrets anything will be you. Their eyes locked, two predators measuring distance before a strike. Fallon looked away first. He mounted his horse without another word. The riders left, hooves kicking up a long trail of dust against the fading light. Silence lingered until the last echo disappeared. Only then did Cassia's legs give out. She turned toward the house, but as soon as the door shut behind her, every layer of strength she'd held collapsed. She covered her mouth, but a broken sob escaped. For months she had held herself together. But today, the final wall cracked. Cassia? Lander's voice moved toward her. Hey. She couldn't hold back. She cried. Not gentle tears, but deep, shaking sobs. Everything she had swallowed since her father died, pouring out at once. Lander didn't speak. He simply reached for her, pulling her into his chest. She fell into him, face buried in his shirt, fingers clutching the fabric. His chest was warm and broad, his breath steady enough to soothe the tremor in her body. Cassia had never let anyone hold her like that. Lander kept her close, his arms firm but gentle, telling her without words that she wasn't alone. When her sobs faded to uneven breaths, Lander spoke. Quiet, low, real. Fallon isn't just a bad man. He's someone I have my own reasons to face. Cassia lifted her head, eyes red and wet. What reasons? Lander looked toward the dark window. His gaze held old shadows, something worn and heavy. Not now, he murmured. But when the time comes, I'll tell you. And Cassia understood. There was a truth waiting ahead, a truth that could change everything. That afternoon, the Montana sky changed without warning. From pale blue to bruised purple, then to a heavy ink black. Cassia looked toward the northern ridge, thick clouds rolling in as if ready to tear the sky apart. A storm is coming, she whispered. Lander stood on the porch, one hand resting on the wooden post. A big one. We'll be inside all night. Wind slammed against the walls, rattling the doors. Cassia bolted the latch, an old childhood fear returning, the fear of thunder that shook her bones every time the sky broke open. Rain fell hard, not in drops but like a river poured over the roof. The small house shook with each gust, the boards creaking as though the wind were trying to pry them loose. Cassia hunched slightly, hands trembling. She tried to hide it, but each crack of thunder sent a jolt through her shoulders. Lander noticed. Come here, he said, voice lower and softer than usual. Cassia hesitated, but a bolt of lightning struck near the hill, thunder exploding right above them. She flinched backward, and into him. Lander reached out, his hand settling gently on her arm. The touch was simple, but Cassia felt herself leaning in instead of pulling away. They sat near the oil lamp. Its wavering flame cast shifting light across her cheek, making her eyes shine as if touched by water. Lander moved a bit closer. It's all right. I'm here. Cassia heard her heartbeat pounding in her chest, then realized something steadier, deeper, was sounding right beside her. Lander's heartbeat. Strong, broad, warm. The distance between them had collapsed into inches. She could feel his breath on her skin, the scent of wood smoke, faint ash from the barn fire, the grounded, quiet scent of a man who had seen too much and still remained steady. Lightning flared through the window. Instinctively, Cassia grabbed his hand. Lander looked down at her fingers, clutching his. He closed his hand around hers. Not hard, not demanding, simply right, natural, and long overdue. Cassia. He said her name for the first time in a voice so low, it sent a shiver down her spine. She looked up. The lamp flickered, throwing their faces into light, shadow, then light again. And in that tender crossing of brightness and dark, the restraint between them finally cracked. Lander leaned in slowly, as though afraid of startling her. Cassia closed her eyes without thinking, as if his lips meeting hers had always been meant to happen. The first kiss was not rushed, not careless. It was the kiss of two people who had survived too much silence, too many stolen glances, too many fleeting touches, and now everything poured into one full moment. When he placed his hand on her back and drew her closer, warmth spread through her, not from the fire but from the feeling of being held, protected, seen in a way she had never allowed. They kissed for a long time in the rhythm of wind and rain, the storm outside fading into nothing, the world shrinking to the heat between them. And then, naturally as breath, that closeness drew them further, deeper, a night where neither spoke, neither hurried, neither forced. They simply followed what had already been building, not to escape the storm outside, but to find peace in each other. Near dawn, when the storm softened into a gentle drizzle, Cassia lay in Lander's arms. Her head rested on his chest, listening to the steady beat of a heart strong as a galloping horse across the plain. Lander pulled the blanket higher over her shoulders, then pressed a soft kiss to her forehead. It held no demand, no urgency, only the quiet care he didn't know how to say aloud. Cassia closed her eyes, feeling for the first time in years that she didn't have to stand against the world alone. For the first time believing that her future might hold the shape of someone walking with her down the long dirt road of Cedar Trail. The storm outside faded. The one inside her eased in the arms of Lander Hayes. The next morning, the first sunlight slipped through the thin curtain, laying a pale gold line across Cassia's cheek. She blinked slowly, feeling the familiar warmth of the blanket. But something warmer, steadier, was wrapped around her. Lander's strong arm curled around her waist. His breath brushed softly along the nape of her neck. His heartbeat thudded with the steady rhythm of boots on soft earth. Cassia turned slightly and found herself staring into gray-blue eyes already open, calm and deep enough to send heat rushing to her face. "Morning," Lander murmured. Cassia yanked the blanket up to hide half her face, her heart kicking hard. I didn't think I'd wake up like this." "And I," Lander said, his voice low and even, "have wanted to see this longer than you think." His words sent warmth up her ears, but beneath the shyness and the flush rising in her cheeks, something else settled inside her. A peace she had never known. As if last night's storm had swept away every fear she'd carried for years. She sat up, adjusting her robe. Lander stood and pulled on his shirt, moving with that same composed steadiness he carried everywhere. Even without looking directly at him, Cassia felt his gaze resting on her. Not possessive, not rushed, but deep and patient enough to tighten her chest. When the kitchen warmed with the small fire, Cassia brewed 2 cups of tea. But as she set his cup down, Lander placed his hand over hers. "Cassia," he said, voice lower than usual, "I need to tell you something." Cassia looked up. There was tension in his face, rare and heavy, like whatever he carried had been with him for years. I knew Fallon before I came to Cedar Trail. Cassia's heart stopped for a beat. Did you work for him? No. Lander shook his head at once. Never. He stepped to the window, looking out at the sunlit stretch of land. His broad shoulders dropped slightly, as if the weight he carried had finally caught up to him. He burned my family's ranch. His voice dipped, rough, frayed at the edges. Cassia froze, her heart clenched. My parents, Lander continued, stood against him when he tried to take their water rights, the same way he's trying to take your land. He sent men to destroy everything. One night, the fire started in the storage barn. I only had time to pull my little brother out. Cassia pressed a hand to her mouth, eyes stinging. And your parents? She asked softly, though she already knew. Lander was silent for a long moment before releasing a slow, exhausted breath. They didn't make it. The small kitchen went so quiet Cassia could hear the wind sliding across the roof. I left that place, Beth, he said. But I swore that if Fallon ever hurt anyone else, I wouldn't stand aside again. Everything made sense now. Why Lander arrived when he did. Why he threw himself into fire for her. Why his eyes darkened every time Fallon's name was spoken. Cassia stepped toward him, slow, certain. She set her hand on his chest, right above the heart beating strong and deep, like echoes of footsteps from his past. Lander, she said softly but steadily, I wish you didn't have to carry those memories alone. Lander bowed his forehead to hers, eyes closing as if that small touch helped him breathe. I carried them for 3 years, he whispered. But last night was the first time I felt like I could stop running. Cassia cupped his cheek, brushing her thumb along the dark stubble of his jaw. You don't have to run anymore. Not here. Lander opened his eyes, looking at her with a mix of tenderness and gratitude she had never seen in any man's gaze. After a moment, he released her and walked to the charred remains of the barn. Cassia followed. Lander crouched, examining the ashes. A scrap of burned paper, caught by the wind, flipped over. What's that? Cassia asked. Lander blew the ash aside, revealing scorched lines of ink. This is a water ledger. His eyes sharpened. Fallon diverted water from the communal spring, illegally. Cassia's eyes widened. You're sure? I'm sure. Lander stood, gripping the half-burned sheet. He doesn't just want your land. He wants to hide his theft from the whole region. And for the first time since the fight began, Cassia saw something new in Lander's eyes. Not just anger, not just protection, but hope. Hope for a victory they could claim together, not only for the land, but for their future. That afternoon, Cedar Trail was quiet in a way that felt wrong. Clear sky, soft wind, too calm for someone like Lander, who had lived long enough to know that danger often hid inside silence. The rebuilt barn still smelled of fresh-cut wood. Cassia checked the stall doors while Lander inspected the fences once more. Johnson worked at the edge of the yard, tying the rope to the water pulley. Everything looks good, Johnson said, wiping his brow. Maybe Fallon's... A sharp crack echoed from the ridge. What was that? Cassia startled. Lander knew instantly, hurried footsteps, heavy, nothing like the sound of wildlife. Inside! Lander sprinted across the yard, hand closing around his gun, but they didn't make it to the house. From behind the pine line, 3 figures charged downhill, faces covered, carrying clubs and oil canisters. Fallon had moved again. Landslide! Johnson shouted as one of them rushed straight toward the new barn, ready to throw the oil. Lander didn't think. He moved. He raised his gun and fired into the air, a warning shot, the crack slicing through the stillness like a clean blade. Two men flinched, but the third kept running. Lander cut across the yard, slamming into him before he could pry the lid off the oil. The impact sent both of them rolling. The man drew a knife, but Lander was faster, pinning his arm, forcing him down with the strength of someone who had survived years of nameless fights. Another henchman fled, disappearing in a cloud of dirt. The one pinned struggled until Lander twisted his arm behind his back. "Stay down," Lander growled. Johnson ran to help tie him. Cassia stood near the barn, pale with shock, but her eyes never left Lander. The captured man looked about 30, thin-shouldered but fierce-eyed. But when he saw he was outnumbered and saw the gun, his breath came uneven. "Fallon hired you?" Johnson demanded. The man pressed his lips tight. Lander hauled him upright, not cruel but firm. "Talk. You're already hurt. If you want to avoid infection, start talking." The man glanced down. A deep gash tore through his calf, blood soaking the fabric. Cassia placed a hand on Lander's arm. Her breath was still unsteady, but her voice held steel. "Let me check his wound." The henchman tried to pull back, but pain kept him still. Cassia knelt, using a clean cloth to wipe the blood. He watched her, the very woman he'd been sent to intimidate, and something in his expression softened. Lander stood directly behind her, one hand on his holster, guarding both her and the yard around them. Minutes later, when she finished bandaging, the man exhaled, a defeated, shaky sound. "He paid us," he muttered. "Fallon wants everyone around the spring gone so he can run a private line for himself. He told us to burn barns, scare folks, make Miss Brooks give up her land." Cassia's throat tightened. Johnson cursed under his breath. "That devil." The man went on, voice breaking. "Today, he told us to finish the job. Said, if Cedar Trail fell again, the girl would give up. I did it for the money." Lander's jaw hardened. "You chose the wrong person to hurt." The man dropped his head. "I know." Silence settled before Johnson said, "We need to take him to town. If he testifies, the mayor will have grounds to investigate Fallon." Cassia looked at Lander. "What do you think?" Lander's gaze sharpened, but there was a glint in it. Small, hard-earned. Hope. "Cassia," he said, "this is the evidence we needed. If he talks, Fallon can't hide in the shadows anymore." The henchman nodded weakly. "I'll talk. I don't want anything to do with Fallon now. The man's more dangerous than you know." Cassia shivered. Lander laid a steady hand on her shoulder. Small, quiet, enough to hold her up again. "Let's get moving," Johnson said. "The sooner the better." Cassia looked around the ranch, the land she had defended with her youth, her tears, her lonely determination since the day her father died. But for the first time, she didn't feel alone. She looked at Lander, the man who had stepped into fire, storm, and night to stand beside her. He met her eyes with a firm nod. The three of them gathered what they needed: saddles, rope, coats. When Cassia mounted her horse, she saw Lander standing beside her, his hand on the saddle, his eyes following her every move. This fight was no longer Cassia versus Fallon. It was both of them. And the road ahead, harsh as it was, felt more hopeful than ever. The road into Cedar Hollow was busier than usual. Rumor traveled faster than wind, and today the entire town drifted toward the square like bees to honey. Cassia rode in with her hands gripping the reins so tight her knuckles turned white. Beside her, Lander and Johnson escorted the bound henchman, his leg bandaged to keep him alive long enough to testify. "I know you're worried," Lander said quietly, the breeze carrying his voice. "But today we can expose Fallon." Cassia nodded, though unease sat heavy in her chest. The town was Fallon's ground. He had money, influence, and the habit of twisting truth into whatever shape served him. As they entered the square, Cassia felt her heart drop. Fallon was already there, not alone. He had 20 men behind him, hired hands, fearful shopkeepers, and debtors who owed him loyalty. Fallon wore a light gray coat, looking like a polished official about to accept applause. When his gaze found Cassia, a thin, blade-sharp smile spread across his face. "Well," he said loudly, "Miss Brooks, I hear you've come to accuse me?" Murmurs rippled through the crowd. "She dares go after Fallon? That Brooks girl is reckless. Fallon's done plenty for this town." Cassia's body tightened. She turned, and Lander's small squeeze at her hand steadied her breath. Fallon stepped up the town hall steps and raised a hand for silence. "I'm told," he announced, his voice carrying across the square, "that someone here claims I burned a barn and endangered a young woman." He gave a quiet laugh. "But I have heard a very different tale. That she and her cowboy attacked my men, injured one of them, and now fabricate a story to cover their crime." Several townspeople nodded at once. A shopkeeper whispered, "If Fallon says it, it's true." Another man muttered, "That Brooks girl should know her place." Cassia clenched her fists until her nails marked her palms. She refused to cry. Not today. She stepped forward. "You're lying." Her voice cut through the square, stronger than she expected. Silence fell. "You sent men to burn my barn," Cassia said, staring straight at Fallon. "You threatened me by letter. You want my land for its water. And we have someone who can testify." Fallon raised a brow, pretending interest. "Oh? And where is this remarkable witness?" Cassia turned to signal Johnson to bring him forward. But when Johnson pulled the rope, no one was at the other end. Only an empty coil fell to the ground. "No," Johnson breathed. "I turned away for 1 minute." Lander rushed to inspect the rope. The cut was clean, made by a knife, footprints dragged toward the alley behind the chapel. Their only witness was gone. "Fallon," Cassia gasped. "He took him." Before she could finish, Fallon pressed a hand to his chest as if wounded. "Me? Kidnap someone? I fear desperation has led to wild inventions meant to hide their own violence." A man in the crowd shouted, "Lander Hayes is a drifter. Who knows what he's done?" Another yelled, "And Cassia, this black girl's been trouble since she inherited that land." The words slammed through Cassia like a blade. She saw Fallon's subtle nod, as if he had been waiting for this moment, to turn the crowd against her. Lander stepped forward, his voice cutting through the noise. "Cassia hasn't harmed anyone. I will bring the truth out. Fallon, you won't walk away." Fallon's faint smile returned, thin, confident. "Good luck, Hayes. Now, unless Miss Brooks has other evidence, the town cannot be expected to believe baseless accusations." The crowd drew back, whispering, their eyes filled with doubt. No one stepped forward. No one offered trust. Cassia's knees weakened. Lander caught her before she fell. "Don't," he murmured, firm but gentle. "Don't break. We're not beaten." But as Fallon mounted his horse, that victorious smirk said one thing with chilling clarity. For now, he was winning. Late afternoon settled heavy over Cedar Hollow, like a damp blanket thrown across the town. No one said it aloud, but everyone knew. Fallon would use the disappearance of the henchman to finish what he'd started with Cassia. Inside the small back room of the town hall, Fallon laid a set of papers on the table. His smile was smooth as silk and just as deceptive. "Miss Brooks," he said, his tone sharp as a finely mixed poison, "this is your final chance. Sign, and you'll have peace." Cassia stood across from him, her hands damp despite the cold room. Lander was right behind her, his presence like steel keeping her upright. Johnson watched the door, tense enough to snap. "No," Cassia said quietly, yet firmly. Fallon tilted his head. "My dear girl, stop pretending to be strong. Everyone can see you have no proof. The town stands with me. You're digging the grave of your own reputation." Cassia opened her mouth, but Fallon pushed a pen toward her, urging once more, "Sign." Her hand trembled. Her whole body felt stretched to its breaking point. Lander set a steady hand on her shoulder. "He's cornering you," he said softly. "Don't sign. It isn't the truth." "But they don't believe," she whispered, voice shaking. "No one believes us." "I do." He answered without hesitation. Those two words held her together when everything else was falling apart. Fallon saw it, smirked. Touching. Sadly, emotion doesn't hold up in law. He shoved the paper toward her again, harder. "Sign." Cassia inhaled, lifted her chin, fighting the sting behind her eyes. "No." Fallon's mouth twisted, ready to snap. The back door burst open. A staggering figure lurched inside. Cassia blinked. Johnson froze mid-step. Lander's hand flew to his gun. It was the missing henchman. His clothes were soaked with blood, his body shaking violently. Rope burns cut deep around his wrists, proof he'd been tied, dragged, and had escaped only by sheer will. People rushed in behind him, filling the hallway. No one breathed. The man lifted his head, forcing himself upright. "Fallon, His trembling hand pointed straight at Fallon, eyes bloodshot with pain and fear. "He hired us to burn barns." His voice cracked but stayed clear. He wants the water. He said, if Cedar Trail burned again, the girl would give up." The crowd erupted. Shouts, anger, gasps. The murmurs rose into a storm. Fallon went pale. "He lies. They forced him." But at that moment, Sheriff Miller pushed through the front row. He seized the man's wrist, examining the deep rope marks and bruises along his jaw. "These injuries," Miller boomed, "aren't from Lander or Cassia. These are marks of a man who was seized and beaten." The crowd shifted, palms dropping from Fallon's back, eyes turning away from him. Miller faced Fallon directly. "Carlton Fallon, you're under arrest for arson, endangering civilians, and attempting to illegally seize community water rights." Fallon erupted. "No, I'm being framed, Two deputies grabbed him, wrenching his arms behind him. Fallon kicked like a cornered animal, eyes wide as he realized the crowd was no longer on his side. Cassia stood frozen, her whole body trembling, not from fear, but from release. Fallon, the man who'd stolen her sleep and shadowed every breath, was being dragged away before her eyes. No power, no allies, only the scrape of his boots against the floor. Lander stepped to her side just in time to catch her as her knees weakened. "You all right?" he murmured, voice low and urgent. Cassia tried to nod, but her throat closed. Tears spilled, tears of relief, not pain. "It's over," Lander said, pulling her into his chest. "You won't face him again." She leaned her forehead against him, listening to his heartbeat, strong, steady, as if sharing her breath. Outside, the crowd roared again as Fallon was dragged across the square. The clink of iron cuffs rang out like the final note of a man who once thought he owned the valley. "He's really gone," Cassia whispered. "Yeah." Lander squeezed her hand. "And he'll answer for all of it." Sheriff Miller returned, giving them a firm nod. "Don't worry. Fallon will stay locked up awaiting trial. He's not slipping away this time." Cassia closed her eyes. With Fallon dragged away, the weight she'd carried for months finally crumbled to dust beneath her feet. She stayed in Lander's arms as the crowd dispersed, and for the first time in weeks, she inhaled deeply without feeling a shadow behind her. At last, Cedar Trail was safe again. News of Fallon's arrest swept through Cedar Hollow faster than the wind that ran across the northern ridges. By mid-morning, from the blacksmith shop to the general store to the small roadside diner, everyone was talking about Cassia Brooks, the young woman who stood tall against a force that many had bowed to. When Cassia and Lander rode back toward Cedar Trail, townsfolk lined the main road, nodding at her with a respect no one had offered a lone black woman on such unforgiving land before. Cassia felt shy under the sudden attention, but Lander walked beside her, his gaze warm with a quiet pride as if to say, "You earned this." That alone made her heartbeat falter for a moment. Later that afternoon, Cassia and Lander stopped by the general store. Mr. Madsen, the owner, the same man who had watched 3 men corner Cassia the day she first met Lander, stepped out with a gentle smile. "We're glad for you, Cassia. Your father would be proud." Emotion rose in her chest. Her father had fought Fallon alone for years, giving in only when illness left him too weak to stand. Today, she had finished what he started. When she turned to Lander, she found his eyes already on her. Maybe he had been looking at her that way since the day he walked into the store, with respect, admiration, and a feeling she had never dared name. Johnson returned to Cedar Trail the next morning. He leaned on his wooden cane, his arm still bandaged, but his face bright. "Seeing you two standing together at the depot yesterday," Johnson chuckled. "Felt like your father was still here to witness it." Cassia flushed. Lander dipped his head to the older man, in the manner of someone silently thanking a father figure for accepting him. With Cedar Trail quiet again, the 3 of them walked the land, checking fences, tending to the horses they had saved. The afternoon breeze moved gently across the golden fields. Lander walked beside Cassia, steadying her elbow when she stepped over muddy patches, or simply standing close enough that the silence between them carried its own meaning. When they reached the northern fence where the new boards still held the scent of fresh-cut wood, Cassia spoke first. "Thank you for being here," she said softly. "Not just yesterday, since the moment you stepped into that store." Lander looked down as though holding something steady inside himself. "Cassia," he said quietly, "I wasn't only protecting this land. I was protecting you." Cassia lifted her eyes, vulnerable yet steady, then, at last, she let the truth she had guarded through fire and smoke find its voice. "I love you, Lander." The breeze seemed to still. Lander closed his eyes, breathing deep, like a man released from a weight long carried. He touched her face. No rush, just a simple contact strong enough to tell her she was seen. "I love you too," he said. "And if you'll let me, I want to stay at Cedar Trail. Not for a season, for good." Cassia smiled, her eyes bright as sunlit water. "Forever is a big promise, Lander." "I know," he said softly, "but this is where my heart found peace because this is where you are." Near sunset, they returned to the porch, the same place her father once drank his morning coffee, looking out across the fields. The golden light turned the porch to warm honey. Lander stood before her, his hands still carrying the trace of work from the day. Without another word, he dropped to one knee. Cassia lifted her hands to her mouth, stunned as though time itself had paused. Lander looked up at her, eyes gentle in the fading light. "Cassia Brooks," he said, voice low as wind brushing wood, "will you allow me to be the man who stands with you on this land, and with your heart, for the rest of our days?" Tears rose, the most beautiful ones she had ever shed. She placed her hands on his face and nodded. Time moved differently on Cedar Trail Ranch. In the West, the years were measured by seasons of rising grass, by foals steadying themselves on their first trembling legs, and by sunsets so wide across the plains that a person could not tell whether they were watching the present or remembering something long gone. For Cassia and Lander, every passing year held the mark of a life they had built through steady hands and a love that endured. After a simple wedding before the Cedar Hollow Church, where the whole town stood in 2 long rows to bless them, Cassia and Lander began expanding the ranch. The old scorch marks Fallon had left behind were replaced with new barns, straight fences, and fields grown rich again. A new sign hung at the gate: Cedar Trail Ranch, plain but proud, much like the two who had made it so. In the small house on the hill, there was now the sound of children running across the wooden floor. The oldest, Isaiah, dark eyes like Cassia, but the wide grin of Lander, was quick on his feet and always exploring. Miriam, the little one, liked to hold her father's rough hands each time he lifted her. They grew up in the smell of dried grass, the echo of whinnies, and the low rumble of Lander's laughter drifting across the yard. Johnson stayed on, settled into the old rocking chair on the porch, watching the children run the way he once watched Cassia. They called him Grandpa Johnson, a name that made his breath hitch before he smiled and answered them. On warm summer afternoons, he told Isaiah and Miriam stories about their true grandfather, Cassia's father, the man who fought for this land when no one else stood beside him. Cassia listened from the kitchen doorway, her eyes softening with every word. Life grew fuller with each season, but what mattered most was the quiet peace, something Cassia once believed she would never touch. Lander was there in every moment, shielding her from the hilltop wind, steadying her hand after long days of work. He was not only a protector, but a partner who listened, and a man who honored every small thing that made their family whole. One late summer evening, with the sky the color of honey and the clouds drifting as though nothing in the world required haste, Cassia stood on the high ridge looking down at the land that once made her weep. The fields that had been threatened with fire were green again. The ground Fallon had walked was now marked only by the tracks of strong horses. Lander came up behind her, laying a warm hand on her back, a gesture he had carried for years. They stood like that for a long while. No words were needed. They both knew every wound, every fear, every night Cassia had lain awake imagining loss had been left far behind them. Cassia tightened her hand around his, soft but sure. "If you hadn't walked into that general store that day," she said, her voice drifting like prairie wind, "I don't know what my life would have become." Lander looked at her, his eyes gentled by the truth in her words. "My heart told me to walk in," he answered, "and it will keep walking toward you, now and all the years ahead." Cassia rested her head on his shoulder. The breeze lifted the scent of young grass. Far below, the laughter of Isaiah and Miriam mingled with the distant cattle bells, shaping the quiet music of a family that had found its place. In the glow of the setting sun, Cassia felt something she once thought she did not deserve: her father's legacy preserved, the love she built protected, and the peace she had dreamed of finally real. Cedar Trail Ranch had once been a place marked by fear. Now it was soil where love had taken root, steady, warm, lasting. And their story closed the same way their life continued. Not loud, not dramatic, but gentle, enduring, and as firm as the prairie after the rains. If you felt the peace woven through this story, we invite you to share a small memory or thought in the comments below. And if this tale is one you wish to keep close, please like the video and subscribe so you won't miss the next warm-hearted story from the Old West. Thank you for staying with us to the end. Wishing you a quiet evening and a heart a little lighter than before.